My name's Jason Mannion. I'm an attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, here only in my personal capacity for my introductory remarks. This panel is on progressive prosecution, which is a topic that has become, I would say, an especially timely one in the last year or two. So we're excited to have this panel here to discuss progressive prosecution. I'm going to take a brief minute to introduce our panelists, and then I will let Justice Hawkins take this away with the moderation and the questions. Joining us today, we have Justice Dan Hawkins, who recently joined the Supreme Court of Ohio. And Justice Hawkins' career is one that makes him very well equipped to handle this. He spent most of his career as a prosecutor and as a state trial court judge before joining the Ohio Supreme Court. And then going down the line here, we have Professor Doug Berman, who is among other things, a criminal law professor at the Ohio State University, Moritz College of Law, where he taught me, and I think many others in this room, probably criminal law. To his left on the panel here is Justin Herdman. Justin is a partner at Jones Day in Cleveland, and as relevant to this panel, he spent 4 years or so as the U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Ohio. So he brings a good federal expertise on the prosecution side, and the office, when he was in charge of that, did quite a bit of work to supplement local prosecutions. And so I'm very interested to hear his takes on the topics today. Next to him is Carol O'Brien, who is, I think, the Deputy Attorney General for Law Enforcement in the Ohio Attorney General's office. She also has a background as a state prosecutor in Delaware County, and can bring some of that more statewide perspective here. And then finally, at the end here, we have Zack Smith. He's here from the Heritage Foundation. He's written a book about progressive prosecution, and so
available wherever books are sold.
I think that the title may give a little hint on his perspective on the topic, but we'll look forward to hearing from all of them. So thank you all for being here and being willing to talk about this topic. And Justice Hawkins, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Thank you. How about a round of applause for our panelists here? Really excited and honored to be here. I'm loving my current job as a justice on your Ohio Supreme Court. I do have my roots as a longtime assistant prosecutor here in Franklin County under then County Prosecutor Ron O'Brien, the longest serving prosecutor in Franklin County history. I headed up his Special Victims Unit for 10 years, prosecuting crimes of violence against women and children. So over 100 jury trials, many cases handled, and really loved the experience. It was a great experience. And I'm honored to be asked to help host and moderate this panel today. I guess maybe I was hoping to maybe start with Zack, you on the end. Your book, subtly titled Rogue Prosecutors, How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. Let's start with this. Why don't you define for us what a progressive prosecutor is and some of your experiences or your research and why you think it's a problem.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me out today. And as you can tell, subtlety has never been my strong suit. And I actually reject the idea that there's anything progressive about these so-called progressive prosecutors. And that's why I named the title of the book Rogue Prosecutors, because fundamentally what these so-called progressive prosecutors are doing, they're subverting the rule of law and they're usurping authority that they do not have. And so as I researched this issue, when it first came to my attention, it was hard to believe that there were prosecutors who were actually refusing to prosecute entire categories of crimes. And the way I first learned about this movement, I was reading the Washington Post one day. It's not something I recommend doing very often, but I was doing it. And I learned about a prosecutor right outside of Washington, D.C. that had said he's not going to prosecute death penalty cases no matter what, no matter the circumstances. And he also said there were entire categories of crimes that he wasn't going to prosecute either. And so it quickly became apparent that this was a broad-based movement where there were many prosecutors, about 60 to 70 today around the country, who have pledged not to enforce entire categories of crimes. And so one of the questions I most frequently get when I'm talking about this idea of progressive prosecutors is why? why are there prosecutors who are not doing their jobs? And I think to understand the why, we have to go all the way back to the 1960s and 1970s in Berkeley, California. Now, you can imagine not many good ideas come out of Berkeley, particularly 1960s or 1970s, Berkeley, California. But there was actually a group of radical academics in Berkeley, California that believed that all prisons should be abolished. Have any of you here heard of Angela Davis by chance, of the Weather Underground fame? Well, Angela Davis, she actually wrote a book called Are Prisons Obsolete?, where her answer were that yes, they are. Prisons are obsolete, and that essentially nobody should be incarcerated for any reason. And you can imagine, once Angela Davis and her colleagues tried to take this idea and implement it into action, it didn't receive a very warm reception either from state legislators or from the public at large. And so if we fast forward to the mid-2010s, what happened was many of the supporters of this prison abolition movement, they realized that they didn't need to do the hard and difficult work of changing the laws on the books if they could simply change who was in charge of enforcing the laws. And so what we saw around 2014, 2015, there were two individuals, one who formerly worked for George Soros, one who formerly worked for the ACLU. They targeted 4 DAs in Louisiana and Mississippi, who they thought were the most egregious death penalty DAs in the country, and with about $1 million in support from George Soros, went in and were very effective in removing those district attorneys. And so what we saw after that, they decided to take this idea nationwide, expand the areas they were focused on, not only to try to elect prosecutors that were opposed to the death penalty, but to also elect prosecutors who are, again, pledging not to prosecute certain categories of crimes. And we can talk about a little bit later about why this is inappropriate for a prosecutor to do. A prosecutor is charged with faithfully enforcing the law, not with enforcing his or her own preferred policy preferences. And I think from a practical standpoint as well, if you look at what has happened in many of these communities, the violent crime rates, murder, rape, robbery, homicide, have increased dramatically since many of these prosecutors implemented their non-prosecution policies. Now, the last thing I'll mention before I turn it back to the justice is I think it's important as part of our conversation today to talk about the idea of prosecutorial discretion. How many of you here have heard the term prosecutorial discretion? Yeah, everybody. Anybody who's been a prosecutor or defense attorney is familiar with the idea. And if you listen to what many of these rogue prosecutors are saying they're simply exercising their prosecutorial discretion in choosing not to prosecute entire categories of crimes. That is simply not true. Prosecutorial discretion, as it's been traditionally understood throughout our nation's history, is the idea that the prosecutor looks at the facts and circumstances of each case and decides what an appropriate resolution would be. Maybe there's an issue with the evidence, so the prosecutor drops the charges. Maybe the defendant enters a plea agreement, and so a shorter sentence is received as a result of that. What these rogue prosecutors are doing is not prosecutorial discretion, it is like prosecutorial nullification. They're appointing themselves one man or one woman super legislators who can insert their own preferred policies over those that the state's duly elected representatives had enacted. And that, frankly, is an abomination to the rule of law, and that is not the role of the prosecutor. So this is a very big problem. As I mentioned earlier, there are currently 60 to 70 of these so-called progressive prosecutors in office around the country today. About half of the nation's population currently lives in a jurisdiction that is under the rule of these progressive prosecutors. And so unfortunately, while some progress has been made in pushing back against this radical movement, there's still much more work that needs to be done.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Berman, I know you're frequently consulted by national and state policymakers, sentencing commissions all across the country. Any reaction from you on?
Oh, I've got lots of reactions.
I figured you
Sure,
got
absolutely.
notes here.
So I'm trying to figure out if Attorney General Pam Bondi would qualify as one of these rogue prosecutors, because on February 5th, she issued a memo saying that enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act would no longer focus categorically on anything other than criminal gangs. Quite distinctive and significant decision, policy decision, to not enforce federal law as against an entire category of potential offenders. I think that's to some degree her prerogative under prosecutorial discretion, but I assume she would not be described as a progressive prosecutor or a rogue prosecutor. You don't like that example? How about former Attorney General Jeff Sessions or former Attorney General William Barr? Federal marijuana prosecutions dropped 90% under their watches. Attorney General Barr, at his confirmation hearing, said he was going to adopt the same policy of the Obama prosecutors, who had actually issued a memo saying they weren't going to enforce federal marijuana prohibition against state-compliant actors. Well, there's no such exception in federal marijuana prohibition, and if you haven't checked recently, you can even go around here in Ohio. There seems to be a lot more federally illegal marijuana activity going on that federal prosecutors are choosing. I don't know, again, you want to call them rogue, you want to call them undermining the rule of law. I think this is what prosecutors do. Although, I want to be clear, there's a big distinction between the prosecutors described in Zack's book and the attorneys general. All the prosecutors in Zack's book were elected by the people. I believe it was Justice DeWine who said how important it was to respect the will of the people. Among the things that's notable about these so-called progressive prosecutors or rogue prosecutors is they typically run expressly on the campaign of, these are my priorities. I want to focus on promoting rehabilitation. I'm concerned about mass incarceration. I want to address racial disparities. And they're being elected on these campaigns. I'm not aware of any wolves, or I guess it would be sheep in wolves' clothing, who say, I'm going to prosecute every death penalty case, and then they get elected and they choose not to do so. Again, the point isn't that there isn't justifiable debate over prosecutorial policies, but the idea that when a prosecutor executes those policies, especially when it's consistent with what they ran on and got elected to, my sense of a lot of the debate is, gosh darn it, I don't like the policies of the people who got elected that I didn't vote for. Well, gosh knows there's plenty of people who express that concern. That's not undermining the rule of law. To me, that's respecting the will of the people. That will can be checked. I think we're going to talk about the U.S. attorneys can come in at times if they think crime is a huge problem or there are other reasons why a prosecutorial policy is causing real disruption in a community. But ultimately, the idea that these folks who run on these campaigns about their own perceptions of what should be priorities for the limited resources of their office, and then implement those policies, and then people don't like what's going on. I'll end with one last point. Look at crime rates now. Philadelphia, the sort of home of the OG progressive prosecutor, Larry Krasner, had fewer murders so far in 25 than any year in recorded history in that city. Similarly, New York is hitting record low crime rates this year. Alvin Bragg, I don't know what you think about him, but ultimately, I think he's probably in the progressive camp. Crime did go up, absolutely, during some progressive campaigns or periods because we had a huge spike in crime during the pandemic, but now it's going back down, and we're seeing in progressive jurisdictions as good or if not better results when we use crime as the metric for the work that's being done. But at the end of the day, these are policy choices. The people voted for these prosecutors. They're implementing their policies. Don't like it? Vote them out. That's the way our democracy works, and I don't think elected prosecutors should be judged by any different standard than whether they're lying about what their policies are going to be. And when they implement them, we may not like the results. We may want to check their results in a variety of ways, but at the end of the day, it's democracy in full bloom.
All right. Well, on that note, Carol, in your current role, obviously working for Attorney General Dave Yost, prior to that, there was quite a period of time where you were the elected county prosecutor in Delaware County. One time, I believe the Ohio Prosecutor of the Year, correct, award,
yes.
rightfully
Thank
deserved.
You. Yes.
But as an elected county prosecutor official, I mean, does anything that Professor Berman say strike a chord with you as far as your experience? You were elected by the people of Delaware County to prosecute, prioritize certain cases. Any response?
Yeah, there's a big response to Doug, and I'm sure he's not surprised. We tend to be on the opposite side on every issue when we're on panels together, but always. What you'll notice, and I'm stealing some of Zack's thunder, is those progressive prosecutors across the country, a large percentage of them have been recalled or lost in recent elections. And that's because the people said, what is this? What do you mean? What do you mean you're going to get rid of this classification of crimes? These are violent crimes. California especially, I think you had 2 who have been recalled or lost in the last couple years. And one of the main faults I saw with those folks, how many in this room have heard of Marsy's Law? Mm-hmm. Okay. In Ohio, it's a constitutional obligation. Shockingly enough, that constitutional obligation came to us courtesy of a California resident whose sister was murdered. And it is also enshrined in the Constitution in California. And what it appeared to most of the public who recalled these folks is they forgot what their role was as an elected prosecutor, and that was to do justice. And it's justice for the victims. It's justice for the families of the victims. It's not to say, I know better than all you people, and I am not going to prosecute these cases. And you know what? When I get rid of the death penalty on a case, I don't need to let the victims know. Yes, you do. The spotlight should be on the victims and not on the defendants. Highly offended by the Menendez brothers' decision out there by the prosecutor who just lost. Highly offended by some of those other issues I saw. It's not tough to do, well, actually, it's very tough to do justice. It's not tough to do your job, because when you take that job, you know what it is. I have been told, and I tend to agree with this. Well, I did have a sheriff tell me he was the most powerful man in the county, and my stepson was kind enough to point out, but he ran into the most powerful woman. So, you should never take your job that way as a prosecutor. It's not about you. It's about how you serve the citizens of the county. And one of the things that's lacking when you have these, and I'm going to use Zack's term, rogue prosecutors, it's the lack of accountability for the criminals out there. How many of you in here have kids? How many of you punish them sometimes? Do you wait 3 years to do it? No, because they don't, short memories. Do you just say, oh, now don't do that again? No, there are sanctions for doing something wrong. And that's what the prosecutor is there for, to at least recommend to the court, because we don't have the final say on what those sanctions are, but we can make our recommendations. And my last point, I take great offense at this constant attack on non-rogue prosecutors who recommend prison, who recommend the death penalty. None of us take that lightly. We know it's taking someone and putting them in a prison, and I've been in many, many prisons, in fact, all of them in the state of Ohio. I wouldn't want to go there. That's going to be my deterrent, well, other things too, but we don't take that lightly. And if you have an opportunity, read my boss's emphasis. He was accused of using his stance on the death penalty for the 2026 election. I was not in the office in Delaware when he requested a jury hand down the death penalty recommendation. My husband was. It's not something any prosecutor takes lightly, but only in the worst of the worst circumstances. I talked too long, I'm sorry. No, thanks.
And on that note, Justin, thinking back to your time as United States Attorney, what type of if assuming there is a problem, federal solutions you would see in the problem? I know Professor Berman talked about some of the overlapping jurisdictions. How'd you approach it?
Well, there's definitely a problem. So I'll just get that out of the way right away. And I say this as, by the way, remember, I'm a former prosecutor. Former prosecutors go one of two ways generally. You either become a judge or you become a defense attorney. So that's what I do now. All right. So I'm a defense attorney. I think, hopefully have somewhat of an objective view on this. But while my time in the U.S. Attorney's Office is probably what put me at this dais up here, I just want to point to one experience I had very early in my career. It was a formative career experience. I started my career at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City, 4 years there, under who I consider to be a legendary mentor, which is Robert Morgenthau. And in that office, there was no discussion about not prosecuting shoplifting or not prosecuting low-level amounts of crack cocaine. That was a conversation that was never had. And I think the results spoke for themselves. I mean, probably my second year in the DA's office, I think there were less than 90 or exactly 90 homicides on the island of Manhattan, which was a historic low. I don't know precisely what stats Professor Berman's talking about, but I know that was a historic low, and I don't believe it's been driven below that under the Bragg tenure. But here's the problem. Even if we're not talking about violent crime numbers, which is, hey, what's the worst thing that can happen to you today? You get shot on the street. Yeah, that's a pretty bad day, okay? But how about day after day after day after day? Have any of you guys been to New York City in the past couple years? Just raise a hand. Okay. I have very fond memories of being a New Yorker and living on those streets and eating outside and taking the subway to work. I don't want to go back there right now. You know, I forget my toothbrush and I have to go down to an unnamed pharmacy. I won't mention it. They're probably a client. And you can't buy toothpaste. You can't buy a toothbrush. You can't get shaving cream because it's all locked behind a glass cabinet. And you got to wait, 45 minutes for somebody to come over and unlock the thing. So there is a real quality of life impact here. And that affects people day in, day out across the socioeconomic spectrum. Everybody is affected by failure to prosecute low-level crime, including shoplifting, in the city of New York. Now, what can you do as a U.S. attorney about that problem? Not much. I mean, I think that there were some creative solutions that were explored around the possibility of there being organized theft rings and this being some sort of a concerted racketeering type organization. I know that there were efforts made to investigate that. But let me focus on two particular areas because I think this is where federal prosecutors can bring to bear the best resources to assist locals. And I will also say, just to be candid, I did not really deal with a progressive or rogue prosecutor problem when I was U.S. attorney. I was very fortunate to have great partners in our county prosecutors' offices, and this was not an issue for me, but I know for many of my colleagues across the country it was. And so what your federal prosecutors tend to do programmatically to assist locals, and remember, if there's a progressive prosecutor who's categorically cut out a whole set of cases that are not going to be pursued under their tenure, you still have law enforcement agencies that are making arrests, usually. They're not going to fail to arrest somebody. They just arrest them, they take them to the DA's office, and there's no complaint sworn out. They decide not to move ahead with the case. So you still have local agencies you can work with as a federal prosecutor. And they need help. So you can say, hopefully working with the county prosecutor, but if you can't, if a county prosecutor has said that they're not going to prosecute juveniles with illegal firearms or a particular type of felony conviction that may make them prohibited under state law, they won't prosecute those cases. You can work with the local agencies to say, look, let's identify which of these 100 arrests that you guys have made that were declined to prosecute because of policy decisions at the DA's office. Let's talk about each of these defendants individually, using that prosecutorial discretion that the professor referenced, right? What's their record? Are they in a gang? Are they suspected of a crime that you haven't been able to arrest them for? These are all the types of considerations that would go into a decision to elect to take a case federally. And same thing on the drug front. Was it fentanyl that was being sold? How much was it? Is this person part of a larger organization? Are there any cartel ties? That's the way that it's very hard work. It's day by day. It takes a real laboring oar to go after it. And it takes really committed and devoted personnel in the U.S. Attorney's Office. But that is how a U.S. Attorney's Office can position itself to deal with any sort of programmatic non-response from a local DA.
Thank you. Now, Zack, your book details or goes into detail. I think you identify 8 specific jurisdictions, cities of district attorneys that are you label as progressive prosecutors, and you go into the statistics that they faced. I guess A, do you want to discuss a little bit about that, and then B, isn't this in their particular? We might have a criticism about how they do things, but they're elected officials, and isn't that what they ran on? Isn't that what the voters asked for?
No, I appreciate that question. And I think in answering that question, I'm going to respond to several of the points the professor made to make sure there's no fake news coming out of our panel today. And so I want to start with some of the examples the professor gave about certain non-prosecution policies at the federal level. I think if you look behind the hood on many of those non-prosecution policies, the difference between those policies and the policies that many of these rogue prosecutors have implemented, in the examples the professor gave, many times there are constitutional concerns about the laws themselves or about how the laws are being enforced. And so I do think it is appropriate for prosecutors to make sure that they are enforcing laws in a constitutionally appropriate way. What you hear many of these rogue prosecutors saying is not that they have a constitutional concern with any of these laws. They simply think they're bad policies. I don't think anyone would seriously dispute that the state cannot criminalize drug possession, that the state cannot criminalize prostitution, that the state cannot criminalize petty theft. Those are simply policy decisions. And these rogue prosecutors that I mentioned in the book simply disagree with those policy prescriptions. Now, in terms of this second point, and I think this goes to your question, Justice, weren't these prosecutors elected? Isn't this what they ran on? And I would actually dispute the characterization that when this movement first started, these prosecutors were forthright with what their goals were. If you listen to what many of these prosecutors were saying, particularly in 2015, 2016, 2017, they were using very bland, anodyne language. They were saying things like they wanted a fair justice system. I agree with that. They don't want to send anyone to prison unnecessarily. I agree with that, and I suspect most of us would agree with those types of statements. What most people did not realize is what exactly these prosecutors meant by those fairly bland-sounding statements and the policies they would enact as a result of those statements. And I think once those policy prescriptions became apparent, as Carol mentioned, you started seeing voters, even in otherwise very liberal jurisdictions like LA, San Francisco, Portland, just to name a few, rejecting these prosecutors and removing them from office. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about crime rates for a minute, because the professor is right. In many of the jurisdictions where these rogue prosecutors are in power, the crime rates have ticked down slightly from their all-time highs. But this makes sense when you consider that certain jurisdictions over the past 5 to 6 years have hit either all-time record highs in terms of homicides and other violent crimes, or have hit half-century highs on a per capita basis, like St. Louis did. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that many of these rogue prosecutors were elected to office, and you started seeing these crime trends before COVID-19 or the COVID pandemic ever became an issue for our country. So this was already moving in the wrong direction. The other thing I would say, there's a very real issue today with the way crime rates are recorded and accounted for, both at the federal level and often at the state level as well. You may have heard toward the end of President Biden's term that crime actually wasn't as bad as it seemed, that it was in fact coming down. Well, it turned out the FBI had changed the way they were reporting certain crime statistics. It turned out many jurisdictions simply were not reporting their crime statistics, and so it artificially deflated what the crime rate was. And we can talk more about that, but that's a very real issue we need to take account of. And then very quickly, the last thing I'll say is to Justin's point about what federal prosecutors can do, particularly when they're confronted with one of these rogue prosecutors at the local level. You know, I think one of the most effective things U.S. Attorney's Office should be focused on is prosecuting 922G cases, felon in possession of firearm cases. And the reason it's so important for U.S. Attorney's offices to focus on those cases is, one, you know by definition, this is already someone who is violating the law. By definition, they're a felon and they're possessing a firearm illegally. And the federal sentencing guidelines, mandatory minimums, are much, much stiffer than are typically available at the state level. And we know often it's a very small number of people in communities who are driving the majority of violent crime. And so this is a very effective way that U.S. attorneys can step in and help combat the violent crime problems in their communities.
So Professor Berman, are the crime rates down because the prosecutors just aren't prosecuting the crime?
So we could spend 3 days unpacking crime rate details. And I just want to encourage everybody to be glad, whether it's in a jurisdiction with a quote-unquote traditional prosecutor or a progressive prosecutor, that crime is going down across the country nationwide, has been doing so, no matter how you want to look at the numbers, since we got away from pandemic era disruptions. And so that's just a good basic story. Again, different folks have, with lots of complicated econometric analyses, said, hey, look, I can see that things are actually better in progressive prosecutor jurisdictions. No, I ran the numbers a different way and they're worse over here. Are you focusing on homicide? Are you focusing on shoplifting? Lots of debate there. My sense of looking over the range of data is we don't see any consistent pattern suggesting that a progressive prosecutor being in charge drives the crime rate up to any definable degree. And in some jurisdictions, at least this is one study that I've seen, it seems to do better. Again, I would put that against the backdrop of some of the comments made earlier. If citizens aren't happy, whether crime is going up or down, or particular types of crimes are being ignored or the focal point, it's, I think, a very encouraging version of a laboratory of democracy. They can be voted out. They have been voted out in many jurisdictions. To me, that's encouraging because the people in that community, again, respect the will of the people, have focused on what that particular prosecutor is doing. I don't think, especially since the progressive prosecuting movement really took off 2018 and beyond, that there have been any, sort of false flags being flown. Oh, I'm really one of the tough ones. And then they get into office and they issue all of these policies, almost all of them. And if you look at the ones who ran here in Ohio, Cleveland and Columbus in the last election cycle, their campaign websites are very clear that they're invested in sort of the progressive prosecutor approach to de-emphasize the use of prison, focus on alternatives to incarceration and the like. And so, again, the crime point is interesting. I want to focus on, I'm not aware of any constitutional concerns, or more accurately, I know for a fact the Supreme Court 20 years ago upheld the constitutionality of federal enforcement of marijuana laws. It's a policy decision. It's a policy decision that it would look bad for the feds to come here and start cracking down on our state legal dispensaries. That's been the policy decision that every administration has chosen to make through their prosecutors. We actually haven't heard it from a president directly. We've heard it from their federal attorneys general. And speaking of constitutional concerns, I actually can tell you plenty of constitutional concerns I have with felon in possession law. It's called the Second Amendment. In fact, we have case law here from the Sixth Circuit. We have case law percolating at the Supreme Court that wide, broad enforcement of felon in possession law clearly raises much more constitutional concerns than wide, broad enforcement of drug laws or white-collar offenses, going back to the Federal Corrupt Practices Act. And so I think that's a fig leaf over the reality that every prosecutor, however they're labeled, rogue, progressive, traditional, not paid attention to, makes policy choices because they have to. They have limited resources and there are too many laws on the books to enforce in any significant way. Arguably, there's probably, by my estimation, 20 million people with some kind of felony record in possession of a gun at any moment across the country. We prosecute 5,000 of them federally every year. There's just no way we have the resources to do more of that. Should we do more of that? Should we all be complaining that the feds through every administration of the last 40 years haven't emphasized this? Because I share the view that it probably would be a pretty good law enforcement technique. Maybe, but that would mean going into people's homes and enforcing our gun laws the way we're now enforcing our immigration laws these days. Is that the sensible policy for an attorney general to adopt? We can debate it. But we shouldn't debate the question of, do every form of attorney general, whatever they're elected to, or in the case of the federal system, appointed to do, have to make policy choices about where to spend and use their limited resources? That's what the job is about, ultimately. And it's perfectly appropriate to complain about the ones you don't think are doing their job well. What's nice about the progressive prosecutor dimension is you can go and vote them out. That's been done. Great. Let's keep debating it. Glad the book's written because it gives folks the chance to see how Zack sees this as a huge problem. I'm going to stick with the will of the people. If a community wants a progressive prosecutor, and presumably they're going to get, hopefully, good information about what their crime rates are, they're going to be informed in a way to decide, do I want to stick with this person or do I want to go in another direction? And I very much respect the choice to go in another direction. That's exactly what our democracy should be about. And I don't think that there's such an obvious script for the exercise of this discretion that we shouldn't respect different perspectives on ways to, as Zack put it, have a fair justice system without unnecessary use of incarceration. different people will have different views about what that means. They can run on it. Whoever gets elected can implement it. If it doesn't go well, we vote them out and try the next person.
Great. So, Carol, I want to ask you, let's assume for the purpose of discussion that there is this progressive prosecution problem in the state of Ohio. Let's start with the state level. I know you don't speak for Attorney General Yost, but in your experience, you're a Deputy Attorney General. Are there certain state solutions or anything you think on your end that could be done to say, hey, we disagree with how the Columbus or Franklin County prosecutor is handling cases, or how Cuyahoga is dealing with cases? Is there discussion, or do you think a solution involving giving concurrent jurisdiction with the Ohio Attorney General in those types of situations?
Well, as Professor Berman pointed out, the progressive candidate in Cuyahoga County lost to in the primary, and I know Mike O'Malley well, and he would be not a progressive prosecutor. He is very committed to upholding his oath. What can the state do? It's sort of limited, and it's very difficult because it involves other folks in the county that the prosecutor is in. There's a state statute, Ohio Revised Code, Section 30905, and then Sections 3.07 and 3.08. which provide for the removal of an elected official for reasons of misconduct, misfeasance, malfeasance, and also misconduct. I have used those statutes on a sheriff, but never on a prosecuting attorney, and it was after he had been indicted. Not in Delaware. It was another county. I was a special prosecutor, though we did remove a sheriff in Delaware County. And so we can use those, but they are cumbersome processes, and the hearing takes place within the county in which the elected official has been elected. So, for example, if it's, I don't want to use Delaware, but we'll use Delaware. Love the elected officials in Delaware. So if it's the sheriff in Delaware County, citizens can bring a complaint, or the governor can bring a complaint based on those bases. It goes before the common pleas judge. Now, for those of you who've been involved in politics, and I know there's a lot of people in this room who've been involved in politics, generally you're of the same ilk in a county. Your judges are going to be from the same party. In Delaware, they're all Republican. Everyone's Republican. We have no Democrat office holders at the county level. So you're taking something to the judge and asking them to find this person that they may have been at fundraisers with or have known. Now, it's hard. I think that's a practical consideration. But I think a lot of judges would say, fine, we're good. I will also tell you that with the exception of the case that I handled after an indictment, I did not find any cases where an elected official at the county level was removed. Usually because the person said, I surrender. I'm waving the white flag. I'm going to resign. I'm going to stop. But it's difficult. Governor DeWine did sign off on a complaint against a prosecutor in Sandusky County. It was brought by my boss, Dave Yost. He was under investigation for all kinds of misconduct in office, but he decided to resign from office so that there was no hearing, nothing happened. That doesn't happen very often. Legislatively, I will tell you as a prosecutor, when Governor DeWine was AG DeWine, I resented every single time he tried to get into my business in Delaware County. Every single time. And every prosecutor I know feels the same way. We actually had 3 elections where incumbents lost in this last election. And it was very interesting. It was maybe progressive light prosecutors all lost. And it was because the people in those counties, one, felt like a bait and switch from the original prosecutor who ran, and then secondly, felt more comfortable with the other one. A lot of times, so anybody here from a small county? Okay, when you're from a small county, most likely your prosecutor, your sheriff, are trying to do a whole lot with just a little bit. So they're overwhelmed. And I know trying to find prosecutors to hire is really, really difficult now. So if there's any young attorneys in here who want to be assistant prosecutors, you'd be well loved. But so when I was at the AG's office the first time, I was kind of the de facto special prosecutor, and I went all over the state trying cases. A lot of miles on my vehicle, got a lot of experience, but I had to be invited in. I couldn't just go if we saw something wrong. And that's pretty much how it stands now. So then AG DeWine established a special prosecutions unit. I will also tell you, as a prosecutor, I never wanted to use that unit unless it was a case I just didn't want to handle. And then I would shoot it to them. Because to Professor Berman's point, I knew the people of Delaware County. I knew what they wanted. I knew what my obligations were under the law and what I swore an oath to. And there are a lot of prosecutors out there who, when that unit was brought up, was established, went, I'm not using them. That has changed through hard work under then AG DeWine and now AG Yost. Developing the relationships with all the prosecutors throughout the state. There's more trust there. They don't think the governor or the AG is trying to usurp their position. They just understand that we're there to help. If you don't want us there, that's fine. If you want us there, we'll come in as the special prosecutor or a special assistant. We'll work to help with appeals. Our Solicitor General section is well loved throughout the state because of the work they do on at the higher appellate levels or even on some others. And if you've never watched our Solicitor Generals or the Assistant Solicitor Generals argue, you should take a moment to do that. They rock. They are so good. It is just breathtaking to watch them argue. I was just talking to Lou Tobin, who is the executive director of the OPAA, Ohio Prosecutors Association. He goes, I'm really mad at your boss now. I go, now why? He goes, because he's trying to take some of our stuff. And I went, every attorney general, I think, since Betty Montgomery has done that because they are law and order and they want to help. And not all prosecutors want that, but those who do will get great service from our special prosecution section, our solicitor section, and any other section, our Medicaid fraud section, healthcare fraud section is what it's called, our charitable section. Any of those sections are willing to help people out there, but don't try to do it without being invited in. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. And Justin, I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that during your time as United States Attorney, you didn't have to deal with a, what you would call a rogue prosecutor. President Trump is in the process of filling out his United States attorneys throughout the country. I guess when we're talking about some of those cities that Zack pointed out, the St. Louis's and the Philadelphias, discuss the importance of the selection of United States attorneys in those jurisdictions that maybe the administration would feel have a progressive rogue prosecutor, and also some of the political realities of there's only so much that the United States attorney can do when you're dealing with elected prosecutors.
Thank you, Justice. So I maybe had a sense that this question was coming, so I didn't address this in my first set of remarks. But the real power that a U.S. attorney can bring to bear in dealing with any sort of kind of widespread problem that they're dealing with, whether it's a criminal threat, whether it's drug overdose epidemic. You have a convening power, and you have a platform that is not available to even an individual county prosecutor in the biggest county. And that platform is very important. It is essential to voice all of the principles that are behind why you wanted to become a prosecutor, why you hire people into a U.S. attorney's office, and why it is that you have detected that there is a failure to act on their oath from somebody who is engaging in wholesale getting out of the prosecution business at the local level. And I saw many of my colleagues do this. I mean, Professor Berman mentioned Larry Krasner. The U.S. attorney that I served with in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania is a guy named Bill McSwain. He did end up running for governor after he was U.S. attorney, so there may have been some other considerations into his use of the platform. But he did do, I thought, a very effective job day in and day out of pointing to deficiencies in that DA's office, their failure to prosecute cases, the effect on violent crime, the effect on quality of life, and was quite combative with that DA. And I think that's something that I would certainly be looking for any U.S. attorney who's going to be appointed in one of these jurisdictions. You're going to have somebody who is an effective messenger, who stays on message about what the administration's priorities are, but also can speak effectively and day in and day out to what are the problems in, say, a progressive or rogue prosecutor's office, and what that's doing to the quality of life and the safety of the community that you have sworn to protect. So messaging is very important. I think it's also important to have, it's very hard to figure this out until you get the person into the job, but you got to have the right type of leadership skills to motivate your office, because some of this work, I mean, you talk about 922G prosecutions. I mean, I will say, as a former U.S. attorney, it was one of the most important programs that we had was our firearms prosecution program. But let's be honest. I mean, most promising attorneys who can get a job as an AUSA, they didn't take the job so that they could prosecute 922G firearms cases. They want to do a big public corruption case. They want to do a white collar case. So I think reminding your people, this is maybe unsaid and forgotten in a lot of places, but reminding your people day in and day out, this is why we're doing the hard work that we're doing. We're prosecuting these relatively low-level firearms offenses or these relatively low-level drug offenses because it makes a difference to the community. You can draw a straight line between those types of prosecutions and lives saved. I said that over and over again when I was U.S. attorney. The other point I'd like to make, in addition to addressing your question, Justice, is I just want to respond to Professor Berman's comments on the democratic process resulting in these elected prosecutors. I mean, last time I checked, these are like usually off-year elections. They are primary based, right? Because the Democrat is probably going to win in many of these jurisdictions. So you have very low-level turnout elections. It's not like this is like somebody, like the thousands of people that tore down the Berlin Wall. That's not what's going on here in electing these prosecutors. They're very targeted races. There's a decision made by the funding sources to find really progressive candidates who are going to drive the agenda of an office in a particular direction, and there is a strategy in place to put these people into office. And it's millions of people who have to live with the decisions of primary voters in these elections. Maybe that's a general observation about the nature of the political system that we live in. And I'm not going to do whataboutism, although I'm sure the temptation is there. But the reality is you're not talking about millions of people who have voted these people in office. It's a primary election that results in somebody on the Democratic ticket in a general election who's usually going to get elected almost always, 95% of the time they're going to get elected in these jurisdictions because of the nature of the political landscape. And I predict that you're going to see a reversal. We've already seen it in San Francisco with a successful effort to recall Chesa Boudin there. I think you're going to start seeing more and more pushback, both at the primary level and maybe even with some independent candidates in some of these jurisdictions. Because my sense, talking to my former colleagues and my friends who still live in New York or people who live in San Francisco or Chicago, is they are fed up with this, and there is going to be a price to pay at the ballot box. And I know that goes to your ultimate point about what the outcome is here, but I do think that it's worth saying that there's a political dimension to this that has resulted in what we're seeing across the country.
Interesting. Thank you. Go ahead, Professor.
I would certainly share the view that unbalanced jurisdictions don't always lead to election results that fully capture the will of the people. I would suggest just that it typically is the people most impacted by justice systems that are most motivated to be a part of debates over who the prosecutor are. And so even though it may not be fully representative, it probably gets a certain intensity of preference. But I think it's a very well taken point that who ends up voting at the primary level for these candidates may not get the attention it deserves. Although, again, I think one of the values of these sorts of debates is getting more people to pay attention. I trust you all will pay even more attention to your next election for prosecutor for these sorts of reasons. I just wanted to highlight one more thing that I think the very progressive prosecutor movement is there trying to sort of highlight in a kind of checks and balances sort of way. Both Carol and Justin's points, nicely highlight that a progressive prosecutor in a local jurisdiction that is going off the reservation too much has a check, I would ultimately say a check of a kind of toughness coming from both the state level and the federal level. And we can use the death penalty as a great example of this. We saw in Florida where a progressive prosecutor said, I'm not going to pursue any death penalty cases, and they were promptly removed by the governor, and the state brought a state prosecutor in to pursue a case capitally. We see in New York, we can use Luigi Mangione. There it wasn't Alvin Bragg deciding not to use the death penalty. It's New York State has never reenacted its death penalty law after the state Supreme Court, State Court of Appeals declared it unconstitutional. So there is no death penalty available at the state level, even if it wanted to be applied in that case. But Attorney General Bondi has decided this should be a capital case federally. That can take place in a range of circumstances, in a range of ways. And I think a huge part of what drove support for the progressive prosecutor movement was a sense that we have these checks and balances that are all running in one direction, or levers of power, that the super tough prosecutor at the local level is not going to get the state AG to say, hey, don't be so tough on those criminals and that good to the victims. Certainly is not going to get a federal response that accords that way as well, that there's sort of a pyramid of toughness that having three different prosecutors necessarily weigh in, especially if it's a high-profile case, makes it extraordinarily likely. And I very much take Carol's point. I don't think any prosecutor savors the opportunity to pursue a death sentence or pursue a long prison term or otherwise seek to impose the harshness of our penal system on anybody unless they think it's entirely deserved. But generally speaking, when you have three layers of government, all of whom are understandably attentive to what is the sort of generic politics of toughness in high-profile cases, you're going to get tougher and tougher results. And the progressive prosecutor movement has been an effort, I think, to say, hey, is this really serving our community? Are there better ways to have accountability and safety other than taking the tough-on-crime approach? And at the end of the day, lots of people, especially people who have been prosecutors, will say, no, that's the way to get safer. Let's be tough on crime. But I'm not only open to, I think, the genius of our country's system of localized elections and localized commitments on top of a pyramid of federalism is to respect the people, to get informed, to show up to vote. And if they don't, I'm sorry, you got to live with the outcome until the next chance to vote, which, I wouldn't be against making the votes more common, or we have recall elections to allow the people to respond even when we don't want to wait until the next election cycle. And again, quite righteous, quite respectable to criticize those decisions made by prosecutors running on these platforms and maybe not doing what you think would be best policy, but understanding where they're coming from and the structure they come from to see virtue in saying, I think we can do better. And in some jurisdictions, not only have they gotten reelected, but they're praised for, in the community's view, having taken a better approach.
Can I make two quick points?
Yes, and actually, and Zack, before we go to you, I do want to leave some time for some questions. So if anybody has any questions, I know if you want to line up at the microphone, but go. I wanted to get to you, Zack, first. Go ahead.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, look, I'll respond to the point that the progressive prosecutors are the only way to reverse this supposed one-way tough-on-crime ratchet. I think that's nonsense. And I think it's nonsense if you look specifically at what has happened in Illinois and California and New York. Consider Illinois. They passed the Safety Act, essentially eliminating bail for most criminal offenses. They lowered the penalties for many criminal offenses. Now, I think these are terrible policies that are ultimately going to result in more deaths in communities. They're ultimately going to harm communities. But I think if a state or community is going to enact a policy, doing it legislatively through the people's elected representatives, that is the appropriate way to do it. The other point I would make is, look, I think Justin's point about the low information, low turnout vote in many of these races is a practical point well taken. But even if we assume that's not the case, even if we assume these are high turnout, high information elections, does that make it appropriate? How do we decide what act should be prohibited in our society? How do we decide what act should be criminalized? Well, if you think back to Schoolhouse Rock, our basic system of government, we do that through the people's elected representatives in the legislature. And the point I often use to highlight this, in my home state of Florida, each county, we have 67 counties, has a local elected tax collector. Now, I imagine a local elected tax collector would be immensely popular at the local level if he ran pledging not to collect taxes, or if he ran pledging to only collect 50% of the property taxes that were due. But does that make it appropriate? Does that make it right? No. Absolutely not. And in many respects, that is exactly what's happening with these local elected DAs. Even if you accept that the local electorate voted for these individuals to nullify state law, that still does not make it a correct moral or legal thing to do. And then quickly on Carol's point about what can states do, I think you're seeing a lot of variation among the states. And I think it really hammers home the distortion that many of these local elected DAs cause when they refuse to do their jobs and enforce the law. Carol is absolutely right. Traditionally, enforcement power primarily has rested with the local elected DAs. But when those DAs are not doing their jobs, you're seeing states scrambling to respond. And some states have given more power to the Attorney General. We saw Louisiana pass a law giving the AG the authority to prosecute certain classes of cases where the state police have investigated it. You're seeing other states using mechanisms to hold prosecutors accountable when they won't do their jobs. In Pennsylvania, we saw an impeachment effort against Larry Krasner that failed. We saw recall elections in California. Chesa Boudin was successfully removed. Pamela Price was successfully removed in Oakland. And then in Florida, as was mentioned earlier, Governor DeSantis, he removed, suspended from office 2 prosecutors who pledged essentially not to prosecute entire categories of crimes. And so there are a variety of responses that are available, but often it's going to take legislative action from the state legislature to enact those responses.
All right. Thanks. Let's go to our question. Jack, I see you're at the mic there. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Actually, Zack sort of answered my first question, so I'm going to reformulate. And the question is a broader one in terms of the whole topic of over-criminalization per se. And I'd like to direct this to Mr. Herdman in your former role as a U.S. attorney, where it just strikes me that in most cases, the decision or the discretion to prosecute under the federal law is almost by nature a political or a policy decision. Unlike what happens, I think, in most counties where the laws are just generally prosecuted. Yeah. Everybody gets prosecuted that breaks the law. I know that's an overstatement. But at the federal level, we know that there's a focus on many fewer prosecutions and that is inherently political. And the question then comes, is that a clue that maybe we have a problem with over-criminalization per se?
So I was very fond of reminding our assistant U.S. attorneys that we had discretion to choose a lot of our cases, if not all of them, especially if we were assuming them from county prosecutors' offices. And somebody like Mike O'Malley didn't have that choice, right? They had to catch whatever came in the door, and they didn't have the luxury of reviewing all the body cam footage and talking to all the witnesses and then deciding if we were going to prosecute the case. So I take that point that you made in sort of in passing while you were giving your remarks. I think what I would say, how I would respond to the political component here in a U.S. Attorney's office is to say the decision should not ever be political. But there is a difference between political decisions, right? Based on, I mean, I take that to mean that there's some political dimension to why you want to take a particular case. That's different than a policy decision. A policy decision that's driven by the president through the attorney general out through each of the individual U.S. attorney's offices. And that policy may be something like, we have to reduce overdose deaths, and we have to use every tool that we have in order to be able to try to achieve that. And there's a whole component at HHS, and there's regulatory issues that you want to be able to drive, but out of a U.S. attorney's office, it's a pretty blunt instrument. Really, the only thing that you can do is go after the supply. And we can have all kinds of debates about how effective that is, but that was the kind of thing that we had to do in order to be able to deliver on that particular priority during the first Trump administration. As to whether or not overcriminalization as a general matter is a problem, I don't know what the current count is, but I've heard everything from there's 12,000 prosecutable offenses in any given United States code book, all the way up to like 6 million, depending on how you want to talk about the subsections that apply and all that kind of thing. So, that strikes me that there might be an overcriminalization problem if that's the case, right? Whether it's 12,000 or 6 million or somewhere in between, that seems like a lot of crimes. And here's the problem with like having all those crimes on the book and not having the legislature do sort of a routine pruning of those crimes is they stay on the books and they wait there until somebody plucks it out of the code and says, hey, this fits that particular set of conduct. And then it does start to raise questions about whether or not there is a political as opposed to a policy dimension to a prosecution like that. So I do think you've hit upon something that I think is really important. But to the Professor Smith's point, this is something that the legislature, I think, is ideally going to be in a position where they have to revisit on occasion whether or not certain crimes that are on the books and all of the elements of those crimes are defined to their satisfaction, to the legislature's satisfaction, and that these are truly embrace a set of conduct that should be punishable under the United States Code.
Well, I appreciate the promotion, Justin. I don't think anyone wants me molding young minds. But look, I do agree with Justin. I think there's two things we're talking about here. One, I think this should be obvious to everybody in the room. The local elected district attorney is going to handle the bulk of criminal cases that come through the system. It's a much more reactive system, whereas the U.S. attorney's offices are going to do important work, but it tends to be proactive, and it's a very small percentage of the crimes that are actually prosecuted. And the other thing I think that's important to keep in mind, yes, I think we should all agree there's too much law. There's too many crimes on the books. The criminal justice system is used today to deal with things that never should be dealt with in a criminal manner. Now, with that being said, unfortunately, I think what you're seeing at the local level with many of these local elected prosecutors, they are not prosecuting core criminal acts. If you think back to law school, what most of us would remember being taught as those malum in se, those inherently wrongful crimes. And that is a very problematic thing when those prosecutors issue blanket policies saying we're not going to prosecute those inherently wrongful types of crimes.
Great. Thank you. Go ahead. We have another question?
I think he was.
I'm sorry. I didn't see you over there. Go ahead.
So my name is Matthew Bedell, again from University of Akron. I am going to just swap the question to focus just a tiny bit. So still on progressive prosecutors, but instead of focusing on their choice to not prosecute crimes, I want to ask about bail reform and the choice to use PR bonds or signature bonds to essentially let criminals go. This has frustrated many police office departments, sheriff's offices, that they do the hard work of bringing a criminal in only for the bail reform methods to allow these people to go back out on the streets. You hear stories of people having 20, 30 crimes that nobody ever prosecuted them for, and then finally something really bad happens, and we finally get the due justice we deserve. But there's so many victims that happened prior to that. I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on bail reform. What you guys think of it?
Carol?
I think that kind of bail reform is absolutely horrendous. Now, keep in mind, the prosecutor at the state level only has the opportunity to recommend. And for as much as the progressive prosecutors say, and the judges always do what they say, believe me, they don't. And I think it's important when you have a serial criminal who's out there that there are consequences. Go back to the kid thing I talked about earlier. If the kid keeps doing it, you keep punishing them. You don't say, oh, well, you've done it so many times, we can't do anything. I think Illinois was the first state to do that. I think they're having some regrets, and I'm hoping that'll change. And you're right. It entirely appropriate for some people to get a low bond or no bond, entirely appropriate. But I don't want someone who's committed murder to get out. I don't want someone who has 6 purse snatchings to get back out again, because what happens next time when someone says, you're not going to take my purse? I think that it was not a well thought out policy, and it was a law, and it was a knee-jerk reaction to the alleged over request for bail, that I think if most people look at how many cases your prosecutors locally handle and see what they're asking for in bail, it's not the problem that it's painted to be.
Well, and I think we have to keep in mind, too, what are the purposes of bail? Why do we have bail? And historically, bail has served 2 functions. It's to make sure somebody shows up to court when they're supposed to be in court, and to make sure that if they're released into the community pending their trial, they're not going to pose a danger to themselves or their community. And unfortunately, what I think has happened in many jurisdictions, particularly in Illinois with the Safety Act, and New York with their bail reform efforts as well, they've prescribed or circumscribed that danger to the community so narrowly that it basically makes it impossible for anyone to be held pending trial under that danger prong. And that's why you often see many of these very violent repeat offenders back out on the street very shortly after they've been accused of committing yet another violent crime. And so, unfortunately, I think you have to look at and make sure that the laws are appropriately allowing the prosecutors and the judges to consider that danger to the community prong when considering whether or not to release someone.
Can I jump in here, Justice, too? Whether it's through bail reform, or I saw it actually not through bail reform when I was U.S. attorney, but I saw it through just volume of cases that were putting real resource pressures on county prisons and their ability to detain people. There was a place, I thought, for U.S. attorneys to step in there. We didn't have a bail reform issue, but we did have we had a volume issue in one particular county, and we partnered with that county to take, you'd have a guy that was arrested on a Monday for dealing fentanyl, released, got arrested again on a Tuesday, these are relatively low levels of fentanyl, but you'd have like 3 or 4 arrests in about a week, and everything, and the person just kept getting released and back out on the streets and selling fentanyl. And so I said, well, we'll just prosecute that guy. We'll take all 4 or 5 of those cases. I mean, our federal judges aren't going to be in love with these cases, but I can explain sort of programmatically why we're doing this, and the fact that it's at the assistance of locals that we're doing it, and trying to help deal with a county that has outsized overdose death rates because of fentanyl. We can step in and try to help. And that was, I think, pretty well received because there was good messaging around it. But bail reform, to me, the real problem is that you're taking away the discretion on whether or not to hold somebody. You're taking it away from the judge, and that's whether I won a bail argument or I lost a bail argument. At least I knew that I had an opportunity to make an argument, and it was going to be well considered by a jurist as to whether or not somebody was going to get out. And I think taking that discretion away and doing it in a really kind of blind, thoughtless way has resulted in exactly the types of negative outcomes that you're discussing. Because a judge sits there, they look at a record, they can size the person up, can figure out if they have family that's in the courtroom, if they have a job, if they have other ties to the community, anything that would lend in favor of releasing somebody. You want to rely on a judge to make those calls and have people present the arguments to the judge. That's what really bugs me about the bail reform effort.
Thank you. I think, Professor, I don't know who's cutting me off. Do we have time for one more question? One more question. Go ahead.
David Trine at the Buckeye Institute. So Justice Gorsuch, in his book Overruled, said there's 300,000 federal crimes, only 30,000 of which have been passed by Congress. So there's a lot of regulatory crimes.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't even know what they are. We're probably all violating some of those as well as state laws. So I'm just interested if this rogue prosecutor movement, Zack, if you look behind the curtain to see why that was occurring, is it because it's a reaction to this overcriminalization and overcharging, or if it's some other motivation? And separately, I'm interested if your next book might be about overcriminalization, and also interested if the professor's thought on these things as well.
Well, I appreciate the question, Dave. And yes, we have written on overcriminalization at Heritage. We've written on the need for mens rea reform at Heritage. So those are all very good and useful things. But in terms of the movement itself, kind of why is it happening? I think if you look at what the advocates of this movement say, in part, why they're pushing these prosecutors not to prosecute certain crimes, they have two, what I believe are very flawed beliefs about our criminal justice system. They believe our criminal justice system is systemically racist, which I would disagree with. And they also believe we have a mass incarceration problem. We lock up too many people, which again, I would disagree with, particularly if you look at our violent crime rates compared to the violent crime rates of many other westernized nations, and particularly if you look at the number of violent crimes that are committed versus the number of people that are in prison for committing violent crimes. I think you can actually make a very credible case we have an under-incarceration problem for violent criminals in our country today. But fundamentally, I think it's those two beliefs, a systemically racist criminal justice system and a mass incarceration problem, that is driving a lot of the underlying ideological underpinnings of this movement.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with those sentiments. I would just highlight the fact that in pressing those points, Zack may not think they're compelling, but the communities that vote for these prosecutors are moved by them. These tend to be communities that have significant members who are justice involved. That's a fancy term for either they themselves have been involved in the criminal justice system or their family members have. And at the end of the day, and it's a different variation on, I will never tell a crime victim how they ought to feel about their victimization, but I also am not going to tell a person who's been through the justice system or family members how they should feel about the justice system, right? I want to hear their input, their take on, is this an overcriminalization problem? And certainly when it comes to low-level drug offenses, a variety of gun possession offenses, the kinds of broken windows advocacy that may be reducing crime, but at the expense of communities that are saying, we want to try a different way. And again, this is where I start and end with the entire progressive prosecutor movement. They're not saying, we've got the solution and don't you dare think about anything else. They're saying, we want to try a different path, and it's going to be for the community to judge whether that's the path that they want to continue on. Again, I have a lot of faith that our system has been both embracing and rejecting some of those alternatives, and bail reform question is a good example where the devil's always going to be in the detail, right? If it's somebody coming along and campaigning on, you know what, I think the system's racist and I think there's too much incarceration, so therefore I'm never sending anybody, rapists, murderers, I don't care what, never going to send any of them to prison. Well, I'm pretty confident they'll not get elected, but if they did, pretty quickly there'll be a recall. Whereas if what they're saying is, I think low-level marijuana offending is not something that we should be arresting or prosecuting people for. I think for drug offenses, we ought to be looking for alternatives that get people the treatment needs addressed. We ought to focus on rehabilitation, community investment as a better use of resources than locking people up. Again, you won't be surprised that that sounds plausible to me, and I think that's itself part of the underlying story here is for a set of communities that have been impacted by what they see as the harms of our justice system, not the benefits, they're inclined to say, somebody's preaching a new path to take, let's give that a go. Again, is that a Pied Piper preaching, or is that really a way we ought to all be looking at their perspective and their understanding of the pros and cons of the system? I think the jury's still out.
And I'd like to respond to 2 points. I love Professor Berman's characterization of what they're saying, but if you read at what these progressive prosecutors are saying, that's not it. They are for no incarceration of anyone. They are for no bail of anyone, and there is no, it is a complete flipping on the head of what the system is set up for, which is to protect the public. The second point is in Ohio, and I keep coming back to Ohio because that's where I'm from, grew up here. A number of years ago, the state legislature, and I'll say in their infinite wisdom because I thought it was really a stupid thing, and I will maintain that, but they passed it. We had to abide with it. On F4s and F5s, which are probably the bulk of the crimes, the option is not prison. There has to be a really compelling reason in their background to have those people sentenced to prison on a conviction. It is not. It is for community control. They're going to go on community control, probation, for those of you who aren't in the criminal justice system. So when you talk about the over-incarceration of the people who are criminally involved, unless you're an F3, F2, or F1, you're probably never going to see the inside of a prison in the state of Ohio.
Well, I think we're about out of time. How about a round of applause for our panel? Thank you all. Great discussion. I'm sure we could speak another hour, but we have other topics to get to. So I want to thank the panel on the progressive prosecution problem. And if anyone in the audience could say that 10 times real fast, you get a free book from Zack. So thank you all very much. Thank you.